In 2013, one man stood in front of thousands of pastors and bishops and did something almost nobody in black church leadership ever does willingly. He announced he was giving up his throne. Bishop Paul S. Morton had built an empire, not a small church, not a regional network, a full-blown international fellowship with thousands of congregations, millions of members, and a reputation for bringing something to Baptist churches that had never fully existed there before: the fire of Pentecost. And then, at the height of his influence, he said, "It's time for someone else to lead this." What happened next? A split, a walkout, a brand new rival organization, a generational war over identity, and a complete transformation of what Full Gospel Baptist even means today. If you've ever wondered what happens to a movement after the man who built it steps aside, whether it survives, whether it splinters, whether it becomes something its founder wouldn't even recognize, stay with me. Because this story has all of that. And by the end, you'll understand exactly what Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship looks like right now, in 2026, and whether Bishop Morton's vision actually survived. Let's get into it. To understand what happened after Paul Morton, you first have to understand what he actually built. Because it wasn't just a church, it was a rebellion. Paul Sylvester Morton Sr. was born in Windsor, Ontario, Canada, the son of a Church of God in Christ pastor. He grew up around Pentecostal fire, the shouting, the tongues, the raw, emotional worship that defines so much of Black Pentecostalism. But in 1972, he moved to New Orleans and joined Greater St. Stephen Missionary Baptist Church as an associate pastor. That church was Baptist, traditional, buttoned up, the kind of Baptist congregation where speaking in tongues or prophesying out loud during service would get you some very uncomfortable looks. When Morton eventually became senior pastor of Greater St. Stephen, he did something bold. He started introducing Pentecostal and charismatic elements into a Baptist church. Speaking in tongues, prophecy, divine healing, things that for generations Black Baptist churches had rejected as too holiness or not our tradition. This wasn't a small controversy. In mainstream Black Baptist life, there has historically been a real theological line between Baptists, who often lean toward what's called cessationism, the belief that those dramatic spiritual gifts ended with the apostles, and Pentecostals, who believe those gifts are alive and active today. Morton basically said, why can't we have both? Why can't a Baptist church also move in the power of the Spirit? By 1992, his own congregation had been transformed by this shift, and in July 1994, Morton and a group of like-minded pastors launched something entirely new: the Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship. The first conference reportedly drew over 25,000 people. 25,000 for a brand new organization. That tells you how much pent-up demand there was for this hybrid identity. Founding leaders alongside Morton included some names that would later become very famous and in some cases very controversial in gospel circles, including Bishops Eddie Long, Kenneth Ulmer, and Robert Blake. The fellowship grew fast. Within a relatively short time, it expanded to more than 1,000 churches. Under Morton's leadership, Greater St. Stephen itself exploded from a modest congregation into a megachurch with more than 20,000 members and multiple campuses. But here's the thing people forget when they talk about Paul Morton's legacy. His path wasn't a straight lineup. It was full of very public, very painful setbacks. In 1997, Morton launched a financial investment initiative within the church, encouraging pastors and congregants to invest significant sums. Many put in around $10,000, with the hope of establishing modern banking services for members. When that plan collapsed, it triggered a personal crisis. In 1998, Morton suffered what's been described as a nervous breakdown, later revealed to be connected to a bipolar disorder diagnosis. He has spoken about this publicly and courageously in later years, about being out of order, about pride in his own name, about having to be rebuilt spiritually and personally. Then came 2005. Hurricane Katrina tore through New Orleans and scattered his 20,000-member congregation across the entire South. Members who had been together every Sunday for years were suddenly displaced to Houston, to Atlanta, to cities they'd never lived in. It would have ended most ministries. Instead, Morton rebuilt, establishing a second base of operations in Atlanta while continuing to lead in New Orleans. Then, in 2006, he was diagnosed with colon cancer. Breakdown, financial scandal, a hurricane that destroyed his church physically. Cancer. This is the man who somehow kept building, and by the 2010s had turned Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship International into an organization with, by some estimates, thousands of member congregations and millions of adherents worldwide. So, when Paul Morton finally decided to step back from leadership, it wasn't the retirement of a man who'd had an easy ride. It was the end of an era built on survival, reinvention, and, a lot of people would say, pure resilience. The question was, could anyone else hold this thing together? Here's where the story turns into something you don't usually hear about in polished church histories, because most organizations don't like to talk about the moment things almost fell apart. In 2013, Morton announced his retirement plan. He wasn't just quietly stepping down, he was handing the fellowship over through an actual vote. The Full Gospel Bishops' Council convened to choose his successor, and the choice fell on Bishop Joseph W. Walker III, the dynamic young pastor of Mount Zion Baptist Church in Nashville, Tennessee. Walker was set to formally assume the role of international presiding bishop starting in 2015. On paper, this looked like a smooth, dignified transition. A founder handing the keys to a hand-picked, council-approved successor. The kind of succession story that makes for a nice Wikipedia paragraph. But underneath that clean narrative was real tension. Bishop Neil C. Ellis, a major figure in the fellowship who led a significant ministry in the Bahamas, had also sought the presiding bishop position. He didn't get it. And rather than stay and serve under Walker, Ellis made a decision that sent shockwaves through the organization. He resigned from Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship entirely. And he didn't leave alone. Ellis took a substantial number of pastors and affiliated churches with him and built an entirely new organization from scratch, the Global United Fellowship. Think about what that actually means. This wasn't a disagreement that got smoothed over in a private meeting. This was a full institutional fracture. Bishops, congregations, entire regional networks, choosing loyalty to a person over loyalty to the fellowship Paul Morton had spent almost 2 decades building. For an organization whose entire founding identity was built around unity, bridging the Baptist and Pentecostal worlds that had been divided for generations, this internal split was almost painfully ironic. The very thing Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship was created to overcome. Division was now happening inside its own leadership structure. Now, to be fair, this kind of succession conflict is not unique to Full Gospel. If you've studied the history of black church denominations and fellowships in America, leadership transitions after a charismatic founder almost always come with some kind of rupture. Founders build organizations around personal relationships, personal charisma, personal trust. When that founder steps back, whoever inherits the role has to prove themselves all over again, and not everyone is willing to wait around and find out if the new leader deserves that trust. So by the time Bishop Joseph Walker officially took the reins in 2015, he wasn't just inheriting Paul Morton's fellowship, he was inheriting a fellowship that had just lost a significant chunk of its leadership and membership to a rival organization. He had to prove, immediately, that Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship could survive without either its founder or the people who had just walked out the door. And that's exactly where the story gets interesting, because what Walker did next didn't look anything like what Paul Morton had done. If Paul Morton's era of Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship felt like a revival, loud, expressive, deeply Pentecostal in energy, built on charisma and spiritual fire, Bishop Joseph Walker's era felt like something almost completely different. Structured, strategic, modern, almost corporate in its approach. And that shift wasn't accidental. It was survival strategy. Walker understood something that a lot of legacy religious organizations fail to grasp. The demographic that filled stadiums for Paul Morton in the 1990s was aging. If Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship wanted to still exist in 20, 30 years, it needed to speak to a completely different generation, one raised on smartphones, live streams, and a much more skeptical relationship with big institutional religion. So Walker rebranded. The fellowship's flagship annual gathering got a new identity. It became known as the Live Full National Conference, a name clearly designed to sound less like a stiff denominational convention and more like an event a 25-year-old might actually want to attend. In more recent years, that conference has carried themes like Next is Now, deliberately signaling that this fellowship isn't stuck honoring its past, it's actively building its future. Walker also pushed hard into theological education, something that had honestly been a soft spot for a movement built more on spiritual fire than academic credentialing. He helped establish the Full Gospel House of Study, essentially creating a formal pipeline for pastors and leaders to receive real theological training anchored in biblical scholarship, while keeping the charismatic, spirit-filled identity that made Full Gospel unique in the first place. It was a way of saying, we can be spirit-led and educated. Those things are not opposites. And then there was the digital transformation. In the years following the pandemic, when churches all over the world were forced to figure out live streaming basically overnight, Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship leaned all the way in. Data-driven ministry approaches, virtual streaming networks, modern technology infrastructure built to reach members who might never physically walk into one of the fellowship's churches, but could still be part of the community online. If you look at recent Live Full conferences, they're live-streamed nightly, reaching audiences far beyond whatever city is hosting the event that year. This is genuinely one of the more fascinating parts of this story. A fellowship that was founded specifically to bring old-school Pentecostal fire into Baptist tradition has now had to modernize itself again. Not theologically this time, but structurally and technologically, just to survive into a new generation. But modernization wasn't the only challenge Walker's leadership had to navigate. No large religious organization gets through a decade of existence without controversy, and Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship is no exception. In 2018, one of the fellowship's affiliated leaders, Bishop Victor Cousins, senior pastor of Inspirational Baptist Church in Ohio and a former member of the College of Elders, admitted to multiple extramarital affairs, including a long-running relationship that had reportedly begun years earlier. Bishop Paul Morton, who was still involved in fellowship leadership at the time, publicly confirmed the misconduct, addressed Cousins' repentance, and confirmed his resignation from his leadership post within the College of Elders. This wasn't just a personal scandal contained to one man's reputation. It became entangled with serious financial trouble at Cousins' own church, which reportedly faced foreclosure proceedings a couple of years later over millions of dollars in unpaid debt, alongside separate legal issues connected to his conduct. For an organization trying to modernize its image and appeal to a younger, more scrutinizing generation, moments like this were a real test. How do you hold leadership accountable publicly without letting scandal define the entire fellowship? Walker's leadership response, transparency about the misconduct, formal removal from leadership positions, reflected exactly the kind of structured, institutional approach that defined his broader leadership style, in contrast to what might have been a more informal, relationship-based handling of discipline in earlier decades. There was also a quieter, more theological tension that had existed almost since the fellowship's founding. The question of whether pastors and bishops were required to personally practice glossolalia, speaking in tongues, in order to be considered legitimate members in good standing. In the earlier years, this created real friction. Some high-profile leaders who had been part of the founding generation eventually distanced themselves from the fellowship, partly over disagreements about how rigidly charismatic practices should be enforced across autonomous congregations. Over time, under more modern leadership, the fellowship moved toward a clearer position of ministerial autonomy, essentially affirming that individual churches and pastors could operate according to their own convictions regarding spiritual gifts, without feeling forced into a uniform standard of charismatic expression just to remain part of the fellowship. It was a pragmatic solution to a theological debate that could have otherwise splintered the organization even further, on top of the Ellis departure. So by the early 2020s, Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship had weathered a leadership succession fight, an entire rival organization breaking off, a public morality scandal involving one of its bishops, and a long simmering internal debate over doctrine and practice. Most organizations don't survive that many hits in that short a window. Full Gospel Baptist did. So let's answer the actual question you came here for. What does Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship look like today, in 2026? The fellowship remains a genuinely massive institution. Some estimates place its reach at around 10,000 affiliated congregations and roughly 2 million members, spanning not just the United States but international communities as well, including strong roots in places like the Bahamas that trace back to those earlier missionary connections. It's headquartered out of Atlanta, and it continues to operate under an episcopal structure with a council of bishops overseeing regional governance. Bishop Joseph W. Walker III is still at the helm as international presiding bishop, and by most accounts, his leadership has been stable enough that he's continued to be affirmed in that role well beyond his first term. Beneath him, the fellowship's governance has expanded into a broader leadership structure, including additional presiding bishops handling regional coordination, figures like Bishop Darrell S. Brister and Bishop Brian J. Pierce Sr., who was installed into an expanded leadership role in 2025. The fellowship is also organized into multiple geographic regions across the country, each overseen by its own regional bishop, coordinating local summits and church affiliations at a more grassroots level. And Paul Morton? He hasn't disappeared. Far from it. Bishop Morton retains what's essentially an emeritus, founder-level advisory role, working alongside his wife and co-founder, Dr. Deborah Morton, through the fellowship's advisory council. He still shows up at major fellowship gatherings, live full conferences, anniversary celebrations, not as the man running day-to-day operations anymore, but as the spiritual patriarch of the entire movement. The founder whose name still opens doors, whose story is still told from the stage, whose theological instincts back in the early 90s are still the reason this entire fellowship exists in the first place. He also continues to lead his own ministries directly, including Changing a Generation Full Gospel Baptist Church and his ongoing role as overseer of Greater St. Stephen Full Gospel Baptist Church, the very congregation where this entire movement started decades ago. He's continued releasing music, writing books, and speaking on subjects ranging from personal transformation to, more recently, his own political and cultural commentary. A reminder that even in his emeritus years, Morton has never been a man content to sit quietly in the background. Here's what's genuinely remarkable when you step back and look at the full picture. A movement that was born out of Paul Morton's willingness to challenge tradition, to bring Pentecostal fire into Baptist churches when almost nobody else was doing that, has now had to challenge tradition all over again, just one generation later, in order to survive. The methods changed. The leadership changed. The style changed from revival tent energy to structured, tech-forward, academically grounded institution building. But the core mission, creating space for spirit-filled worship inside Baptist identity, without forcing every single congregation into one rigid mold, that's still intact. And honestly, that might be the most important part of this whole story. Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship didn't just survive its founder's departure. It survived a leadership schism, a doctrinal fight, a public scandal, and an entire generational shift in how people engage with church. And it's still standing, still growing, still holding conferences that reach audiences far beyond anything Paul Morton could have streamed to back in 1994. Whether you see that as proof of God's hand on the movement, or simply proof of smart institutional leadership under Bishop Walker, one thing is hard to argue with. Paul Morton's vision didn't die when he stepped down. It evolved. And in a religious landscape where so many founder-led movements collapse the moment their founder walks away, that evolution might be the real legacy here. So that's the real story of what happened to Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship after Bishop Paul Morton stepped back. The split with Neil Ellis and the Global United Fellowship. The corporate and academic transformation under Bishop Joseph Walker. The scandals the fellowship had to navigate publicly, and where the organization actually stands today, in 2026, with Morton still very much present as its honored founder. If this kind of deep dive into church history, leadership transitions, and the real behind-the-scenes story of major ministries is something you want more of, make sure you hit subscribe, because there's a lot more of this coming. And if there's a specific church, ministry, or leader you want me to break down like this next, drop it in the comments below. I read every single one, and a lot of my next videos come directly from what you all ask for. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.